In exactly 4 hours, 12 of the most decorated veterans I ever served with will be loaded into crates and sold for scrap metal. These aren't men, they are multi-purpose canines, heroes who survived the dust of Yemen only to be labeled disposable inventory by the country they bled for. My name is Jaxson Thorne, and I just found my brother's dog, Ghost, starving in a rusted cage at Camp Ironwood. They call them surplus. I call them family. The auction starts at 3 a.m., and if I don't act now, their final legacy ends in a cold price tag. The rain didn't just fall in the Olympic Peninsula, it reclaimed the earth. A relentless, rhythmic drumming against the corrugated tin roof of the cabin that served as Jaxson Thorne's sanctuary and his self-imposed cell. To anyone else, the sound might have been soothing, a lullaby of nature, but to Jaxson it was a metronome. It kept time with the steady, practiced movements of his hands as he disassembled his Sig Sauer P226 on the scarred oak workbench. The cabin smelled of gun oil, cedar wood, and the damp, earthy scent of a forest that never truly dried out. Jaxson didn't need the light of the single kerosene lamp flickering on the edge of the table, but he kept it there anyway, the amber glow dancing off the jagged silver lines of scar tissue that mapped his forearms. He worked by feel, a tactile prayer he had performed thousands of times in places where the air was thick with sand instead of mist. His fingers moved with a surgeon's grace and a predator's economy, sliding the slide from the frame, removing the recoil spring, and lining the components up in a perfect, equidistant row. Precision was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. Out here, in the deep green shadows of the Pacific Northwest, precision was the difference between being a man and being a memory. A low, guttural huff vibrated through the floorboards, followed by the heavy thud of a tail against the wood. Maverick, a Belgian Malinois-German shepherd mix whose coat was the color of burnt embers and midnight, didn't move from his spot by the hearth, but his ears tracked every click of the metal. Maverick was a creature of kinetic energy held in a state of permanent, coiled readiness. He had been through the breach with Jaxson, survived the IED in the Kunar province that had left Jaxson with a permanent limp and a heart made of cold iron. They were two halves of a broken whole, tethered by a bond that transcended the need for words. Maverick knew when the memories were winning. He knew the difference between Jackson's peaceful silence and the silence that preceded a storm. Jaxson reached for a lint-free cloth, dabbing it into a small tin of CLP. He wiped down the barrel, his eyes fixed on the way the light caught the rifling. The silence of the mountain was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against his eardrums. It was a stark contrast to the cacophony that lived inside his skull, the rhythmic thwump thwump of rotor blades, the panicked shouting over a radio net, and the wet, choking sound of a man trying to say goodbye. He looked down at his left hand. The ring finger was missing the top knuckle, a souvenir from a rooftop in Aden. He flexed the hand, feeling the dull ache that the damp weather always brought to the surface. "Too quiet tonight, Mav," Jaxson muttered, his voice gravelly from days of disuse. Maverick lifted his head, his amber eyes locking onto Jackson's. The dog didn't bark. He simply stood up, his claws clicking softly on the floor as he walked over to rest his massive head on Jackson's knee. It was a grounding ritual. Jaxson took a deep breath, the scent of wet dog and gun oil filling his lungs, and he felt the tension in his shoulders drop an inch. He ran a hand over Maverick's ears, feeling the notched scar on the left one where a piece of shrapnel had tucked in close. In this world of moss and mist, Jaxson had carved out a life of simplicity. He chopped wood until his muscles screamed. He hiked the steep, rain-slicked ridges until his lungs burned, and he spoke to no one but the dog and the occasional clerk at the general store 20 miles down the mountain. It was a redemption of sorts, or at least a distraction. He was trying to outrun the man he had been, the man who had been a scalpel for the government, cutting out cancers in the dark corners of the globe. But the problem with being a scalpel is that you never really lose your edge. You just get tucked away in a drawer, waiting for someone to pick you up again. He began to reassemble the pistol. Slide to frame, click, function check. The sound of the dry fire was a sharp, definitive crack that seemed to echo louder than the rain. Jaxson set the weapon down and reached for a small wooden box tucked into the corner of the workbench. It was an old cigar box, the cedar stained dark with age. He didn't open it often. Inside was a single silver coin, a Tier 1 Operator's Challenge coin, and a crumpled yellowing photograph of a 5-man team standing in front of a dusty Humvee. He didn't look at the faces. He couldn't. Instead, his thumb traced the edge of the coin, specifically a small, jagged X scratched into the metal. It was a secret mark, a private joke between him and a man named Caleb. Caleb, who had been the best navigator Jaxson had ever known. Caleb, who had stayed behind to hold the line in a crumbling compound in Yemen so the rest of the team could get to the birds. Caleb, who was supposed to be dead. The mountain air suddenly felt thinner. Jaxson closed the box, his heart rate spiking for the first time in months. He stood up, crossing the small cabin to the window. The forest was a wall of black and gray, the Douglas firs swaying like mourners in the wind. He felt a familiar prickle at the base of his neck, the primal instinct that had kept him alive in places God had long ago abandoned. He wasn't alone. Maverick felt it too. The dog was suddenly at the door, his body stiff, a low, vibrating growl beginning in his chest. Jaxson didn't reach for the pistol on the workbench. Instead, he reached for the tactical knife strapped to the underside of the kitchen table. He moved to the shadows beside the door, his breath shallow and controlled. Through the small, salt-crusted pane of the window, he saw it. A faint blue pulse of light from the gravel driveway. It wasn't a flashlight. It was the rhythmic blinking of an encrypted transceiver. A moment later, a heavy thud hit the porch. Not the sound of a footstep, but the weight of a package. Jaxson waited. 1 minute. 2. The forest remained silent, save for the rain. He signaled Maverick to stay, then cracked the door. The cold air rushed in, smelling of ozone and pine. Resting on the welcome mat was a Pelican case, professional grade and waterproof. There was no mailing label, no return address. Just a single word scrawled in white grease pencil on the lid. Snake Eye. Jackson's blood went cold. That had been his call sign in the sandbox, a name he hadn't heard or spoken in 5 years. He brought the case inside, Maverick sniffing the edges with frantic curiosity. Jaxson sat back down at the workbench, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden violent return of a life he thought he'd buried. He popped the latches. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was a ruggedized satellite phone and a single transparent evidence bag containing a shell casing and a piece of fabric. It was a swatch of tan Nomex, scorched at the edges and stained with dried dark blood. But it was what was pinned to the fabric that stopped Jackson's heart. It was a small, hand-carved wooden bead, a good luck charm from a village in the Hadramount Highlands. The satellite phone began to chirp, the screen illuminating the dim cabin with a harsh, artificial white light. There was no caller ID, just a string of coordinates that mapped back to a location 3,000 miles away. Jaxson looked at Maverick. The dog's ears were forward, his eyes bright with a sudden, renewed purpose. The quiet life was over. The mountain was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage. Jaxson picked up the phone, his thumb hovering over the accept button. He He knew that once he pressed it, the ghosts wouldn't just be in his head anymore. They would be at his door. "Yemen," he whispered, the word tasting like copper and dust. "Caleb, you son of a bitch, what have you done?" The phone vibrated again, more insistent this time. Outside, a crack of lightning split the PNW sky, illuminating the cabin for a fraction of a second, turning Jaxson Thorne back into the shadow he had tried so hard to outrun. He pressed the button. The voice on the other end was distorted, layered through layers of encryption, but the cadence was unmistakable. "The clock is ticking, Snake Eye. Extraction in 6 hours. Don't be late." Jaxson didn't answer. He didn't need to. He stood up, grabbed his go bag from the hidden floor compartment, and looked at Maverick. The dog was already waiting by the door, his tail a steady, rhythmic thud. The transition was instantaneous. The veteran was gone, the operator was back. And this time, he wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for blood. The screech was not the cry of a forest predator, but the grinding of iron against rust as the heavy perimeter gate of Camp Ironwood groaned under the weight of Jackson's truck. The transition from the moss-drenched serenity of the Olympic Peninsula to this scarred landscape of concrete and chain link was a violent shock. Here, the air didn't smell of cedar. It smelled of stale diesel and wet asphalt. The rhythmic thumping of the tires against the bridge felt like a countdown, a mechanical heartbeat echoing the clock inside Jackson's head. For a man who had spent 5 years trying to forget the sound of boots on gravel, the crunch of the driveway beneath his wheels felt like stepping back into a uniform that no longer fit. Maverick sat rigid in the passenger seat, his eyes tracking the shadows. He didn't whine, but his entire body was a wire under high tension. He could smell the stress hormones in the air and the cold, flat odor of steel. To anyone else, Camp Ironwood was just another decommissioned base, but to Jaxson, it felt like a graveyard. He stepped out, the damp wind biting at the scars on his arms. The silence here was hollow. He looked down at the satellite phone, the coordinates glowing a ghostly blue. They had led him 4 hours away from his sanctuary, straight into a ghost story. The Snake Eye package wasn't just a summons. It was a map to the sins of the past. Moving with the practiced shadow walking of a man who had spent a decade in the dark, Jaxson signaled Maverick to heel close. They reached Warehouse 4, a corrugated behemoth reclaimed by the salt air. The padlock yielded with a muted click, and Jaxson waited, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. At first, there was only the hum of an old ventilation system. Then he heard it, a low, collective whimper vibrating in the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of an animal shelter. It was the sound of a barracks under duress. He clicked on his tactical light. Rows of reinforced transport crates were stacked high. Through the wire mesh of the nearest crate, a pair of eyes caught the light. Gold, intelligent, and utterly broken. It was a Belgian Malinois, his ribs visible beneath a coat that had lost its luster. The dog didn't bark. He simply rested his chin on his paws and watched Jaxson with a look of weary resignation. Jaxson felt a cold anger coil in his gut. These were Tier 1 assets. These were the dogs that had cleared rooms in Fallujah and sniffed out IEDs in the valleys of Afghanistan. They had saved countless lives, traded their youth for the safety of men who now viewed them as an accounting error. "Steady, Mav," Jaxson whispered. He moved deeper, his light dancing over the labels. Asset number 8824, status, non-recoverable. Disposition, terminal auction. The word terminal felt like a physical blow. Jaxson knew what it meant to be considered surplus, to have the world move on while you were still standing there, waiting for orders. But to sell them for scrap metal under the guise of an inventory liquidation was a betrayal that violated the only law he still respected, the bond between handler and K9. He reached the center of the warehouse, where a small office stood like a glass island. On the desk sat a clipboard with the morning's schedule. 3 a.m., logistics pickup for scrap processing. Lot 12, multi-purpose canines, decommissioned. Beside it sat a folder with a name scrawled in red. Ghost. Jackson's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a photo of a younger Malinois standing next to a man whose face was blurred by a security stamp. But Jaxson didn't need to see the face. He knew the tactical vest and the way the man held the leash. It was Caleb's dog, the dog that had supposedly been KIA alongside Jackson's brother during the final breach in Aden. The loop from the cabin closed with a sickening snap. The coordinates weren't for a rendezvous with Caleb, they were for the discovery of the only piece of his brother that was still breathing. But the loop that opened in its place was vast. If Ghost was here, hidden in a black site inventory, then the story of what happened in Yemen wasn't just a tragedy. It was a cover-up. And the auction wasn't a standard disposal. It was a way to make the evidence disappear forever. "Ghost," Jaxson called out. A crate shifted in the corner. There was no growl, just the dry, frantic scraping of claws against metal. Jaxson ran toward the sound and dropped to his knees. The dog inside was a ghost in every sense. He was gaunt, his fur matted, a jagged scar running from his shoulder. When the light hit his eyes, the recognition was instantaneous. The dog tilted his head, a faint, rhythmic thump-thump of his tail hitting the bottom. It was the same rhythm Jackson's brother had used to signal all clear. "I've got you, buddy," Jaxson whispered, his throat tight. He reached through the wire, feeling the fevered heat of the dog's skin and the tremor of exhaustion. For a second, the veteran and the K9 were the only two living things in a world of scrap metal. He looked at his watch. 11 p.m. In exactly 4 hours, the heavy loaders would arrive. They wouldn't see heroes. They would see 12 crates of disposable inventory to be loaded into a furnace. Jaxson stood up, the pain in his body forgotten. He looked at Maverick and then back at the 12 crates of silent eyes. He had come here for a ghost, but he had found a brotherhood. The mountain, the cabin, the quiet life, it all felt like a dream. He knew now why Caleb had sent the coin. It wasn't an invitation to hide, it was a command to fight. He didn't just have to save Ghost, he had to save them all. To do that, the life he had built as Jaxson Thorne would have to end. He would be Snake Eye again, a man operating outside the law to protect the only thing the law had forgotten. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the challenge coin, the silver cold against his palm. He looked at the jagged X and then at the gate he had just bypassed. There was no path back to the cabin. There was only the 4 hours of darkness between him and the end of a legacy. Jaxson gripped the handle of the bolt cutters, the metal biting into his skin. "Nobody gets left behind today," he rasped, the words a vow that echoed through the cold warehouse. The rain outside turned into a downpour, drumming against the tin roof, but the rhythm was no longer a metronome, it was a war drum. He took a step toward the first row of crates, knowing that by dawn he would either be a savior or a hunted man. As he looked into the eyes of the 12 veterans waiting for their sentence, he realized he had never been more alive. The bridge to his sanctuary wasn't just closed, it was gone. Jaxson Thorne didn't look back as he threw the first latch. The click of the first latch had been a victory, but the roar of the second alarm was a death sentence. Before Jaxson could even reach for the second crate, the heavy industrial lights of Warehouse 4 flickered to life with a blinding, sterile brilliance, washing away the shadows he had used as a shield. The sudden glare revealed the grim reality of his situation. He wasn't just in a warehouse. He was in a trap designed by people who knew exactly how a man like him would think. He stood frozen for a split second, the silver challenge coin still gripped in his palm, its edges biting into his skin as if to remind him that the past never truly stays buried. He didn't have time to process the betrayal or the speed with which the perimeter had been breached. The sound of boots, fast, heavy, and synchronized, erupted from the loading docks, echoing off the high corrugated ceiling like a roll of thunder. 3 SUVs, black and windowless, skidded onto the concrete floor, their tires screaming against the grit and oil. Jaxson instinctively reached for his sidearm, but his holster was empty, his primary weapon still tucked in the hidden compartment of his truck 100 yards away. He was an operator caught in the light, a lion in a cage of his own making, stripped of the tools that had defined his existence for 2 decades. "Maverick, back!" he roared, his voice cracking with a desperation he hadn't felt since the rooftops of Aden. But the response was already in motion. The first canisters of CS gas hissed across the floor, spewing thick, acrid white clouds that burned the lungs and clouded the vision. Jaxson dove behind a stack of rusted pallets, his knee barking in protest as the old injury from the Kunar province flared like a branding iron. The damp cold of the warehouse floor seeped through his clothes, a chilling reminder of his age and the frailty he had tried so hard to ignore. He heard Maverick yelp, a sound that cut through Jackson's heart deeper than any blade. The dog was being targeted by specialized capture teams. 2 men in tactical gray, devoid of any patches or identifying marks that would link them to any legal entity, moved with the cold efficiency of machines. They didn't use bullets. They used high-voltage prods, their blue arcs of electricity illuminating the swirling gas like miniature lightning strikes. Jaxson watched, pinned by the searing pain in his leg and the suffocating weight of the gas, as Maverick was cornered near a row of decommissioned crates. The dog fought like a demon, a blur of fur and teeth, his instinct to protect his handler overriding his own survival. But the crackle of the prods was relentless. When the electricity hit Maverick's flank, the dog collapsed, his muscles seizing in terrifying spasms, his breath coming in ragged, pathetic gasps. Jaxson tried to stand, to scream, to charge the men with nothing but his bare hands and his rage, but a heavy boot slammed into the small of his back, driving his face into the cold, oil-slicked concrete. The taste of iron and grit filled his mouth as his lip split against the stone. He felt the crushing weight of a knee in his spine and the familiar, humiliating bite of heavy-duty zip ties cinching around his wrists with a sharp, ratcheting sound. He was turned over, his vision swimming through the haze of the gas and the tears of frustration. Standing over him was a man whose face was a mask of professional indifference, a face Jaxson had seen in the sterilized halls of government buildings a decade ago. It was a face that represented the bureaucracy of war, the men who moved pieces on a map without ever feeling the breath of the enemy. "You should have stayed on your mountain, Snake Eye," the man said, his voice a flat, dead drone that carried no malice, only the chilling cold of a foregone conclusion. "Some ghosts are meant to stay buried. These assets are already off the books, officially processed and accounted for. You're just making the final audit difficult." Jaxson watched with a hollow, crushing helplessness as the heavy loaders began to move. The warehouse, once a silent tomb of memories, became a hive of mechanical destruction. The forklifts hummed, their forks sliding under the pallets holding the 12 crates of veteran K9s with a sickening metallic clang. He saw Ghost, his brother's dog, the last living link to the family he had lost, cowering in the back of his cage as he was lifted into the air. The dog's eyes found Jackson's through the wire mesh. There was no understanding in those eyes, only the pure, unadulterated fear of an old soldier who didn't know why he was being abandoned by his own kind once again. Ghost let out a low, mournful howl that was drowned out by the roar of a diesel engine, a sound that felt like the earth itself was screaming. "Stop it!" Jaxson rasped, his throat raw from the gas and the scream he couldn't release. "They served. They gave everything. You can't just erase them like they're scrap metal." The man didn't even look back as he signaled the drivers. "We aren't erasing them, Commander. We're liquidating them. In the New World, there's no room for sentiment in the budget, and there's no room for broken weapons that refuse to stay broken." They dragged Jaxson toward a small, windowless office at the back of the warehouse, a concrete box that smelled of stale cigarettes, damp rot, and the lingering scent of old grease. They threw him inside, his bound hands hitting the floor first, sending a shock of pain through his shoulders. The heavy steel door slammed shut, the sound of the deadbolt sliding home echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. Then silence. Or at least the silence of a man who has lost the last thing he had worth fighting for. Jaxson sat in the dark, the only light a sliver of gray from a high barred vent that allowed the smell of the coming storm to drift in. He could hear the distant mechanical sounds of the crates being loaded onto the transport trucks outside. Each rumble of a departing engine was a nail in a coffin for the 12 heroes he had failed to rescue. He was 54 years old, his body was a map of scars and broken promises, and he was sitting in a puddle of dirty water while the brothers he swore to protect were being driven to their deaths. The darkness of the room was nothing compared to the darkness that began to settle in his soul. Jaxson had always been a man who found God in the mission, a man who believed that as long as he followed the code, the unspoken covenant of the warrior, there was a reason for the pain. He had survived IEDs, ambushes, and the loss of his brother by clinging to the idea that there was a righteous path, however narrow. But as he sat there, listening to the rain begin to drum against the warehouse roof with the same relentless rhythm he had heard in his cabin, he felt the last threads of that faith snapping. He thought of the nights at the cabin, the quiet hours spent cleaning his rifle, thinking he had finally found a version of peace. It had been a lie, a beautiful, moss-covered delusion. He hadn't found peace. He had just found a place to hide from the fact that he was part of a machine that didn't love him back. And now, the world was reminding him that there is no hiding from the truth of a life spent in the shadows. The flag he had bled for didn't care about the color of his eyes or the names of the dogs he loved. The God he had occasionally whispered prayers to in the dust of Yemen felt more distant than the stars. He looked down at his wrists, the plastic ties cutting deep into the skin, right over the scar tissue from a dozen different deployments. He felt old, not the seasoned, capable age of a mentor, but the heavy, brittle age of a man whose time has passed. He thought of the men and women his age back in the civilian world, people who were preparing for retirement, playing with grandchildren, or sitting in wooden pews on Sunday mornings, finding comfort in the routine of a quiet life. They looked for meaning in the small, soft moments. Jaxson had searched for meaning in the noise of battle and the weight of a rifle, and now that the noise was gone and the rifle was taken, he was a hollow shell. "Was it all for nothing, Caleb?" he whispered into the dark, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself in decades. "All those miles we walked, all those rooms we cleared, all the blood we left in the sand to buy people time they didn't even know they needed. Was it just for this? To die in a utility closet while they treat our partners like trash to be burned?" He thought of Maverick, lying somewhere out there, hurt and terrified, wondering why the man who always kept him safe had allowed this to happen. He thought of the tagline that had been the heartbeat of his career, the phrase he had repeated to every junior handler he had ever trained. Courage walks on 2 legs and 4. It felt like a mockery now, a cruel joke played on those who believed in loyalty. What was courage when the people you fought for were the ones holding the prod? What was loyalty when it only went one way? The physical pain in his knee was a steady, throbbing reminder of his mortality, a sharp needle of fire that pulsed with every heartbeat. But the ache in his chest was worse. It was the ache of a man who realized he was obsolete. He had spent his life becoming the ultimate weapon, a scalpel for the state, and once the surgery was over, the state had no use for a tool that had developed a conscience. He felt a tear, lone and hot, trace a path through the grime and the dried blood on his cheek. It wasn't a tear of fear. Jaxson had stared into the eyes of death too many times to be afraid of the end. It was a tear of profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He was tired of being the only one who remembered the names. He was tired of the wait. He closed his eyes and saw the village in the Hadramaut Highlands one more time. He saw the children laughing as Caleb passed out candy from his rucksack. He saw the wooden bead, the good luck charm, being pressed into his hand by an elder whose eyes were as old as the desert. He had carried that bead for years, believing it was a tether to something good, something that justified the killing. But as the last transport truck engine roared and then faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of the rain, Jaxson Thorne realized the tether had been cut. He was drifting in a void where heroes were just inventory, and sacrifice was just a line item. He slumped against the cold concrete wall, his head thumping against the stone with a dull, hollow sound. He didn't try to break the ties. He didn't look for a hidden blade in his boot or a loose bolt in the door. He just sat there, a broken operator in a forgotten corner of a dying base, waiting for the end of a story that should have ended with a medal and a handshake. The silence was absolute now, a heavy shroud that smelled of diesel, ozone, and ancient unwashed failure. He felt the weight of every man he'd lost, every dog he'd left behind, and every prayer that had gone unanswered by a silent heaven. He was at the bottom. There was no more mountain to climb, no more ridge to hold, no more mission to complete. There was only the dark and the cold. But then, through the thick, reinforced steel of the office door, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't the heavy tread of a guard or the metallic click of a weapon. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching against the metal, a sound so small it should have been impossible to hear through the rain. It was followed by a familiar low whine, and then the definitive heavy thud of a tail hitting the doorframe in a specific, uneven pattern. 2 short, 1 long. The signal for friend. But then something happened. The scratch came again. It was a faint, desperate sound scraping against the unforgiving steel of the utility closet door. Jaxson kept his eyes closed, convinced his shattered mind was projecting the ghosts of his past into the physical world. He was a man drowning in the deep end of his own despair, hallucinating the shoreline. But then came the whine. It was sharp, pitched with an unmistakable urgency, cutting through the heavy scent of diesel and his own stale sweat. The thud of the tail against the doorframe repeated. 2 short, 1 long. It was the all-clear rhythm, the very cadence Caleb used to tap on the radio mic in the valleys of Yemen. Jaxson opened his eyes, staring into the oppressive blackness of the concrete box. His breath hitched in his chest, a jagged pull of air that tore at his bruised ribs. He dragged his bound hands against the floor, inching closer to the heavy door. The silence of the warehouse was suffocating, pressing down on him with the weight of an ocean, but that tiny scratching sound was a lifeline thrown into the abyss. The heavy deadbolt echoed with a loud, metallic clack. The sound made Jaxson flinch, his muscles instantly tensing as he braced for the final, unceremonious bullet of a liquidation squad. The heavy steel door groaned on its hinges, swinging outward. Instead of the blinding muzzle flash of a suppressed weapon, a narrow beam of yellow light sliced through the darkness. It was a standard-issue flashlight held low, illuminating the oil-stained concrete. In the center of the beam stood Maverick. The dog was panting heavily, his fur matted with grease and the residual chemical dust of the CS gas, but his eyes were bright, focused, and alive. He didn't wait for a command. Maverick shoved his snout through the gap, pressing his cold, wet nose against Jackson's cheek, letting out a low rumble of absolute devotion. Jaxson choked on a sob, leaning his face into the dog's neck, breathing in the scent of wet fur and life. Behind the dog stood a silhouette. It was a young man in the tactical gray uniform of the capture teams, but his posture was wrong. He wasn't standing with the rigid, cold readiness of an operator. His shoulders were slumped, his hand shaking slightly as he lowered the flashlight. "Quiet, buddy," the guard whispered to the dog, his voice cracking with a nervous youthfulness that didn't belong in a black site warehouse. He stepped into the closet, pulling a tactical folding knife from his belt. Jaxson backed up instinctively, but the guard dropped to his knees. "Hold still, Commander," he murmured, slipping the blade under the heavy plastic zip ties binding Jackson's wrists. With a sharp tug, the plastic snapped. Blood rushed back into Jackson's hands with a painful, burning sensation, but it was the pain of the living. "Who are you?" Jaxson rasped, rubbing his raw wrists, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Miller," the kid replied, holstering the knife and handing Jaxson his sidearm and an extra magazine. "I'm just a contractor. I was supposed to run perimeter checks and log the manifest." Miller looked down at Maverick, reaching out a trembling hand to stroke the dog's ears. Maverick leaned into the touch, sensing the young man's lack of malice. "I saw the files," Miller continued, his words tumbling out in a rushed, terrified stream. "I saw the service records, 3 deployments, explosive detection, search and rescue. They had medals in those files, Commander, commendations. I have a golden retriever back home. His name is Barnaby. He's afraid of thunder." Miller swallowed hard, looking up at Jaxson, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "I couldn't do it. I watched them load those crates, and I saw the way that old Malinois looked at you. They told us these were just defective assets, broken machinery, but they're not. They're soldiers. I couldn't just stand there and let them burn." Jaxson stared at the young guard. In the rigid, unforgiving world of military bureaucracy, men like Miller were anomalies. They were the statistical errors that ruined perfectly calculated equations of cruelty. As Jaxson looked at the kid, a profound sensory shift washed over him. The oppressive, suffocating darkness of the concrete closet seemed to recede, chased away by the fragile, trembling beam of Miller's flashlight. It was just a small, inexpensive bulb, but in that moment it felt like the first ray of dawn after a decade of night. Jaxson listened to the rain pounding against the corrugated tin roof above. Just minutes ago, the relentless drumming had sounded like a funeral dirge, a mechanical metronome ticking away the final seconds of his legacy. Now, the rhythm transformed. It was no longer a war drum signaling defeat. It was a heartbeat, thump, 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 thump. It was the pulse of a world that was still worth fighting for. He thought of his brother. Caleb had always believed that faith wasn't found in grand, sweeping miracles. Caleb had argued that God didn't reside in the perfect execution of a mission or the sterilized halls of command centers. God was in the quiet spaces. He was in the mercy of a stranger. He was in the trembling hands of a kid named Miller, who risked a treason charge because he remembered a golden retriever who was afraid of thunder. The profound weight of that realization cracked the hardened shell Jaxson had built around his soul. His faith hadn't been abandoned by heaven. It had simply been obscured by his own cynicism. He looked down at Maverick, the dog standing tall, completely unbothered by the lingering pain of the electrical shocks, ready to follow his handler into hell all over again. Jaxson reached out, resting his hand on Maverick's broad, strong head. He felt the steady hum of the dog's life force, the unwavering, pure dedication that demanded nothing and gave everything. The old tagline he had taught for years suddenly wasn't a mockery anymore. It was a sacred truth, a testament to the divine partnership between man and beast. Courage walks on 2 legs and 4. It requires both to face the darkness. It takes the human capacity for choice, the choice to show mercy, the choice to stand up, and the animal capacity for unconditional loyalty to create a force strong enough to shatter the machinery of indifference. The heavy despair vanished. The fatigue melted away. Muscle memory replaced sorrow. Jaxson stood up. His knee throbbed, but it was just data now. Pain was information. Information meant he was alive. He checked the action on his sidearm. The metallic clack was crisp, sharp, and purposeful. He slapped the magazine home. "How long ago did the trucks leave?" Jaxson asked. His voice wasn't a rasp anymore. It was a command. 10 minutes, Miller said, standing up, visibly drawing strength from the sudden transformation in the veteran. "They're heading for the old incinerator facility on Route 9. Heavy transports. They can't move fast on the wet mountain roads. You have a window, but it's closing." "What about the capture teams?" "Following in the SUVs, 4 men per vehicle. Heavily armed. They think you're neutralized." Miller handed Jaxson a set of keys. "Your truck." I pulled the immobilizer they slapped on the wheel. Jaxson took the keys. The metal felt warm in his hand. He looked at Miller. There was no time for lengthy speeches. "You need to disappear, kid. When they realize I'm gone, they'll check the cameras." "I looped the feed in this sector," Miller said, a faint smile breaking through his fear. "I'm heading for the tree line. Just go get them, Commander." Jaxson nodded. He stepped out of the utility closet and back into the sprawling, empty warehouse. The scent of diesel and CS gas still hung in the air, but he breathed it in like oxygen. He wasn't a relic. He wasn't an obsolete tool left to rust. He was Snake Eye, and he had a pack to save. "Maverick," Jaxson snapped. The dog fell into perfect step beside him. They moved in absolute synchronicity, 2 halves of a single, lethal weapon. The shadows of the warehouse no longer felt like a trap. They were his domain. He burst through the side exit, the cold rain washing over him in a freezing, baptizing deluge. The storm was at its peak, the wind howling through the valley, masking the sound of his approach. He spotted his truck parked near the tree line, a dark, imposing silhouette against the gray night. He threw open the door. He didn't bother wiping the rain from his face. He punched the ignition. The engine roared to life, a deep, guttural growl that matched the fire reigniting in his chest. Maverick vaulted into the passenger seat, his eyes locked on the road ahead, his ears pinned back in absolute focus. Jaxson threw the truck into gear. The tires spun, gripping the wet gravel, launching the heavy vehicle forward into the storm. He had 10 minutes to make up, 10 minutes to intercept a convoy of ghosts before they were turned to ash. The windshield wipers slashed furiously against the glass, matching the frantic, rhythmic beating of his restored heart. He checked his sidearm one last time. He shifted into high gear, the truck tearing down the mountain road, plunging straight into the heart of the darkness. He was coming for them. The tires screamed as Jaxson hauled the steering wheel hard to the left. the heavy Ford Raptor fishtailing out of the warehouse gravel and onto the old logging road that bypassed the main security gate. He didn't turn on the headlights. He didn't need them. The dashboard's dim amber light was the only thing illuminating his face, casting long, sharp shadows that made his eyes look like two hollowed-out craters of resolve. He knew this terrain like a surgeon knows the anatomy of a failing heart, having mapped these back roads during training exercises a lifetime ago. Beside him, Maverick braced his muscular paws against the dashboard, his dark, intelligent eyes scanning the tree line as the infrared sensors of the truck glowed a faint, ghostly green in the cabin, painting the interior in the hues of a night vision operation. Jaxson reached over with his right hand, the one with the cracked knuckles and the fresh, angry welt from the zip ties, and ripped the plastic casing off the overhead console. With a sharp, rhythmic tug, he severed the wires to the GPS transponder and the internal cellular uplink. The truck went dark on the grid. He was no longer a tracked asset. He was a ghost chasing ghosts through the freezing marrow of the mountains. The rain was no longer just a storm. It was a physical barrier, a wall of freezing water trying to push his 3-ton vehicle off the jagged ridge. The wipers thrashed at maximum speed, a rhythmic, violent slap, slap, slap that filled the cabin with the sound of a ticking clock, counting down the seconds of 12 lives he swore to protect. Jackson's knee burned, a localized sun of white-hot agony behind his patella, pulsing with every shift of the gears and every pressure on the brake. He didn't reach for the half-empty bottle of painkillers in the glove box. He used the pain. He welcomed it. It was a tether to the physical world, a cold reminder that he was still made of blood and bone, not just the hollowed-out resentment that had defined his life for the last 5 years. He wasn't thinking about the betrayal anymore, nor was he replaying the flat, dead voice of the bureaucrat who had called his brothers assets. He was thinking about the 12 crates. He was thinking about the way Ghost had cowered in the back of his cage, a hero reduced to a shivering pile of fur because the country he bled for had forgotten how to say thank you. He checked the digital clock on the dash, the numbers glowing like radioactive embers. 2:22 a.m. The auction, the liquidation, as the official manifest called it, was scheduled for exactly 3 a.m. at the Route 9 incinerator facility. He had 38 minutes to cover 20 miles of treacherous, winding mountain road and neutralize a professional, well-funded security team that likely thought he was still rotting in a concrete utility closet, bound and broken. He hit the shifter, the engine's roar drowning out the howling wind for a split second as the truck climbed the steepening incline of the pass. Every vibration of the chassis felt like a heartbeat. He felt the truck's weight, the way the specialized tires grabbed the slick mud, the subtle, dangerous slip of the rear end on the moss-covered rocks. He was operating at a level of environmental awareness he hadn't accessed since the rooftops of Aden. The rust was falling off his soul, replaced by a cold, surgical precision that felt like coming home. The first physical obstacle appeared 3 miles up the pass, exactly where the maps in his head said it would be. A temporary security checkpoint had been established at the narrow bridge crossing Blackwater Creek, the only bottleneck on the southern route. It wasn't standard military protocol. It was the work of the gray-uniformed contractors, civilian muscle with military toys. 2 black SUVs were parked slantwise across the narrow tarmac, their strobe lights flickering blue and red against the wet, ancient pines like a fever dream. 3 men stood in the middle of the road, clad in heavy tactical rain gear that shimmered under the strobes, holding short-barreled carbines with the casual, dangerous boredom of mercenaries who had never seen real combat. They weren't expecting a 3-ton piece of Detroit steel to come barreling out of the tree line without its lights on. A shadow within a shadow. "Hold on, boy," Jaxson muttered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that resonated in his chest, A command Maverick understood instinctively. He didn't slow down. He didn't tap the brakes. Instead, he slammed his foot onto the floor, pinning the accelerator to the firewall. The Raptor's supercharger whined, a high-pitched metallic scream that signaled the release of 600 horses. Jaxson grabbed the emergency brake, timed the slide with the instinct of a man who had driven extraction vehicles under heavy fire in a dozen different time zones, and shoved the truck into a controlled, violent drift. The side of the Raptor clipped the rear bumper of the lead SUV with a bone-jarring crunch of metal and shattering glass. The impact sent a shockwave through Jackson's spine, rattling his teeth and jarring his injured knee. But he steered through the spin, the heavy-duty tires catching the edge of the embankment and propelling him forward. A spray of bullets rapped against the tailgate, metallic pings that sounded like hammer strikes on an industrial anvil. But he was already past the kill zone. He saw the guards in his rearview mirror, frantic, disorganized shapes shrinking into the darkness and the spray, their strobe lights swallowed by the trees as he plunged back into the black. The adrenaline was thick in his throat now, tasting like copper and old iron. Suddenly, the smell of the damp pine needles and the ozone of the storm vanished. For a heartbeat, the physical world fell away, replaced by a sensory echo so sharp it made his lungs ache for the dry air of the desert. In his mind, the world turned white-hot and bone-dry, smelling of coriander, parched earth, and the metallic tang of sun-baked brass. Yemen. 2014, the Hadramaut Highlands. The sun was a white-hot hammer beating against the back of his neck, relentless and unforgiving. Caleb was sitting on a rusted ammunition crate, his face caked in fine beige dust that turned his eyelashes white, laughing as Ghost, then just a lean, hyperactive pup with ears too big for his head, tried to catch a lizard in the shade of a parked Humvee. "Look at him, Jax," Caleb had said, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy, salt-stained sleeve that smelled of gun oil. "He doesn't care about the mission. He doesn't care if the local intel is bad or if the high-value targets moved overnight. He doesn't give a damn about the politics of the Highlands. He just cares that we're here. That's the secret, man. We fight for the flag, but they fight for us. It's an uneven trade, isn't it? We owe them everything, and they just want to scratch behind the ears and a place to sleep near our boots." Caleb had reached down and ruffled the dog's ears, and Ghost had looked up with that same unwavering, soul-deep loyalty that Jaxson had seen in the warehouse. It was a devotion that transcended politics, budgets, and disposable inventory. The memory flickered and died, snuffed out by the freezing spray of the rain hitting the windshield and the amber glow of the dashboard. "We owe them everything," Jaxson whispered into the dark, and the words didn't feel like a memory. They felt like a terminal order. He was different now than he had been even an hour ago. The hesitation that had plagued his every movement at the cabin, the slow, silent rot of obsolescence that had colored his mornings, was gone. His hands moved with an economy of motion he hadn't possessed in years. He wasn't the snake eye who had been discarded. He was the commander of a unit of 2. While steering with his knee on a straightaway, he reached into the back seat, pulling a heavy tactical plate carrier over his shoulders and cinching the straps tight with a single, practiced yank that knocked the wind out of his chest. He checked the action on his sidearm, the metallic clack of the slide sounding like a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. He wasn't just reacting to the world anymore. He was imposing his will upon it. He wasn't a broken tool left to rust in the rain. He was the master of the craft, returning to the field for one final, righteous extraction. He saw the tail lights of the convoy through a break in the trees. 2 miles ahead, weaving through the jagged black silhouette of the pines like dying embers, were the red lights of the transport convoy. 3 heavy cargo trucks, their engines roaring with the effort of the climb, flanked by 2 more escort SUVs. They were moving slowly, hindered by the sheer weight of the armored crates and the precariousness of the rain-slicked mountain curves. Jaxson killed his interior lights completely, plunging the cabin into a world of charcoal and shadow. He knew the road ahead better than the men driving those trucks. 2 miles from the incinerator facility, there was a sharp, narrow hairpin turn that hung over a 600-foot drop into the canyon. The trucks would have to crawl. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the leather. His heart wasn't racing with the frantic, shallow beat of fear. It was thumping with the steady, heavy rhythm of a war drum in the deep of the night. He looked at Maverick. The dog was standing now, his front paws braced firmly on the center console, ears pinned back and teeth bared in a silent, predatory snarl that showed the white of his canines. Maverick sensed the proximity. He knew the hunt was nearing its bloody conclusion. "Almost there, Maverick. Almost there," Jaxson murmured, his hand briefly touching the dog's flank. The facility loomed in the distance, a concrete monolith perched on the edge of a sheer cliff, its high-voltage fences sparking blue in the heart of the storm. The chimney was already belching a thin, pale smoke into the black sky, a sickening sight that confirmed the furnace was preheating for its final, horrific task. Jaxson felt a surge of cold, focused rage that burned brighter than any physical pain in his joints. He wasn't just saving dogs, he was protecting the last shred of honor in a world that had traded its soul for a budget line. He was the line in the sand. He slammed the shifter into 4 low, the truck's massive transmission clunking as it prepared for the final, vertical assault on the facility's access road. He could see the silhouettes of at least a dozen handlers at the facility gates, their umbrellas and heavy-duty flashlights moving like restless fireflies in the dark. The perimeter was lit like a stadium, a stark contrast to the darkness he had used as a shield. He was 1 man and 1 dog against a privatized army with high-voltage prods, automatic weapons, and legal immunity. He accelerated into the final turn, the transport trucks now less than 300 yards away, their engines straining against the incline. He was closing the gap, a predator silent and swift in the heart of the tempest. But as he looked at the sheer number of guards swarming the facility entrance and the heavy steel reinforcement of the gates closing behind the lead truck, a singular, icy thought cut through the heat of his adrenaline. He had the will. He had the weapon. He had the dog. But as the heavy gates of the incinerator facility began to grind shut to seal the inventory inside, Jaxson Thorne felt the crushing weight of the odds pressing against his chest. Would this be enough? The tires of the Raptor didn't just roll. They screamed across the wet asphalt of the Station 9 entry pad, a high-pitched wail lost instantly to the industrial roar of the primary furnace. Jaxson could smell it now. Not just the rain and the ozone, but the heavy, cloying scent of sulfur and preheated steel. It was the smell of the end. He watched the heavy gates of the incinerator facility, a double slab of reinforced iron, grinding shut with a slow, agonizing finality. The lead transport truck was already inside, its taillights disappearing into the cavernous, white-lit maw of the loading bay. To anyone else, it was just a gate. To Jaxson, it was a coffin lid. He glanced at Maverick. The dog was a coiled spring of fur and muscle, his eyes reflecting the harsh sodium glare. Maverick wasn't afraid. He was waiting for the man he had chosen to lead him into the mouth of the beast. Jaxson didn't touch the brake. His injured knee screamed a protest as he braced himself, a jagged lightning bolt of pain that shot from his patella to his hip. He ignored it. He was done with the politics of survival and the cold logic of the acceptable loss. He slammed the accelerator to the floor, the supercharger's whine reaching a fever pitch that vibrated through the steering column. The Raptor hit the gate at 40 miles per hour. The sound was a tectonic shift, a symphony of rending metal and shattering safety glass. The impact threw him forward against the harness, the tactical plate carrier grinding into his ribs. The world turned into a kaleidoscope of gray metal and blue sparks, and then, with a final, violent shriek of hinges, the truck was through. He skidded across the slick concrete floor, the tires spinning for purchase before he brought the vehicle to a halt between the transports and the glowing maw of the incinerator intake. He was out of the truck before the engine died, his sidearm raised in a two-handed grip. The air inside the bay was a localized hell. "Security, drop the weapon!" The voice came from a man on the elevated catwalk above the lead truck. It was Sterling. Major Elias Sterling. Sterling wasn't wearing a uniform anymore. He was wearing a tactical jacket and a headset, his face set in the professional neutrality of a man getting paid to forget his own name. Behind him, 12 guards moved into a tactical semicircle, their carbines leveled. Red dots of laser sights danced across Jackson's vest like angry hornets. "Jaxson, stop," Sterling shouted. "Look at yourself. You're a decorated commander, not some vigilante. You're bleeding, you're limping, and you're throwing away a 30-year career for crates of scrap metal. Step back. Get in your truck, drive out, and we'll erase the last 2 hours. I'll personally sign the report saying you were never here. You can have the pension. You can have the peace you've been whining about for 5 years. All you have to do is turn around and let us finish the manifest." The temptation hit Jaxson with the force of a physical blow. It was the easy path. It was the life he had convinced himself he wanted. The isolation, the removal of all responsibilities except the next bottle of whiskey and the next sunrise. He could walk away. He could go back to being the man who didn't care, who had let the world rot because he was too tired to hold up his end of the bargain. He looked at the trucks. He could hear the scratching now. 12 sets of paws against aluminum. 12 hearts beating in the dark, trusting that the world was still a place where loyalty meant something. He looked at the incinerator, the door sliding open, revealing a cavern of orange fire that looked like the throat of perdition. "They're not inventory, Elias," Jaxson rasped, his voice cutting through the mechanical hum. Tension vibrated in the air, a tight wire about to snap. He felt the old Jaxson, the snake eye who saw dogs as equipment, trying to claw back to the surface. That version of him whispered that Sterling was right. That survival was the only true medal, that he owed these dogs nothing. "Don't be a martyr for a dog, Jax," Sterling sneered. "It's a bad look. They're tools. When a hammer breaks, you toss it. When a K9 ages out, you liquidate. It's the budget. It's the law. It's the way the machine works. You're just a gear, man. Don't try to stop the clock." Jackson's eyes moved to Maverick. The dog hadn't moved from his side. He was staring at the catwalk, his hackles raised, a low vibration beginning in his chest. Maverick wasn't looking at the guns. He was looking at Jaxson, waiting for the signal. In that moment, the tension reached its peak. The lasers were steady on his heart. One word from Sterling and the world would end in a hail of 5.56. Jaxson felt the sweat stinging his eyes, the smell of furnace grease turning his stomach. He thought of Caleb. Faith wasn't about grand miracles. It was about what you did when the easy path led to hell. "I'm not a gear anymore," Jaxson whispered. He didn't aim for Sterling. With a sudden burst of motion, he dropped his aim and fired 3 rapid shots. The bullets struck the hydraulic manifold of the loading dock's conveyor system, the lines exploding in a spray of red fluid and white steam. The massive steel doors of the incinerator hissed and stalled as the system detected pressure loss. The alarm began to wail. a rhythmic shriek that signaled the death of the machine. "Kill him!" Sterling roared, but the bay was disappearing into a fog of hydraulic mist. Jaxson didn't fire back at the guards. He turned and slammed the butt of his pistol against the secondary release lever of the lead transport truck. The heavy aluminum door of the first crate fell away. A shadow leaped out. It was Ghost. The old Malinois didn't hesitate. He smelled the fear and saw the betrayal, and he let out a roar that was more wolf than dog. Jaxson moved to the next crate, and the next, his hands moving with surgical speed. One by one, the liquidation inventory became a pack again. The consequences were immediate. The guards were suddenly faced with 12 elite predators no longer confined by cages. The loading bay became a blurred landscape of gray uniforms and flying fur. Jaxson felt a bullet graze his shoulder, a white-hot sting of lead, but he didn't stop. He was the center of the storm. He reached the final truck, releasing the last of them, a scarred German shepherd who looked at Jaxson with a momentary expression of recognition before joining the fray. The sound was deafening. The alarms, the shouts, the snarls of justice. Sterling was screaming from the catwalk, his authority evaporating. The furnace was dead. The machine had ground to a halt. Jaxson slumped against the truck, his breath coming in ragged, painful gulps. His jacket was soaked with rain and blood, but as he looked at the chaos he had unleashed, the crushing weight of the last 5 years finally lifted. For the first time since he buried Caleb, his chest didn't feel squeezed by an iron band. He had made his choice. He wasn't a relic. He was a protector. As Maverick leaned against his leg, Jaxson Thorne knew he had finally found his way back to the light. The battle wasn't over, but the soul of the commander was no longer for sale. Courage had walked on 2 legs and 4, and for one glorious, violent moment, it had won. The dawn didn't break with a bang. It bled into the valley like warm honey, slow and amber, washing away the charcoal shadows of the night at the incinerator. Jaxson sat on the porch, his legs stretched out and his injured knee wrapped in a clean compression sleeve. For the first time in 5 years, the pain didn't feel like a debt he was paying to a forgotten past. It felt like a souvenir. The air was crisp, tasting of pine needles and damp earth. Beside him, Maverick lay with his chin on Jackson's boot, his breathing a deep, rhythmic anchor that kept Jaxson pinned to the present. The silence of the mountain had changed. It was no longer the hollow silence of a man waiting for the end, but the full, vibrant silence of a home that had finally found its soul. The cabin had transformed. The whiskey bottles that once lined the windowsill were gone, replaced by veterinary manuals and bags of high-protein kibble. The ruin was now a sanctuary. Below the porch, in the clearing, Jaxson had fenced off with reinforced cedar. The inventory was scattered across the grass like a pride of lions. 12 dogs, 12 heroes. They were a landscape of scars and lean muscle, of silvering muzzles and intelligent eyes losing the glazed look of the kennel blind. They moved with a newfound grace, their tails up, sniffing the mountain air as if they were tasting freedom for the very first time. The smell of cedar and fresh rain lingered in the air, a clean scent that signaled a new beginning for all of them. Jaxson stood up, his movements deliberate. He walked down the porch steps, and as he reached the grass, the pack moved toward him. They didn't rush him with frantic energy. They approached with the measured respect of soldiers. The old German shepherd with the notched ear, the one Jaxson had pulled from the final crate, walked up and leaned his weight against Jackson's leg. It was a sign of trust that no official manifest or bureaucrat could ever quantify. Jaxson reached down, his fingers finding the thick fur behind the dog's ears, feeling the steady thrum of a heart that was no longer scheduled for liquidation. The open loops of the last decade were finally closing. The official word from the Bureau was a deafening silence. After the footage from Jackson's Raptor and the internal server data he'd liberated reached the right advocates, the gray-uniformed contractors had vanished like smoke. There would be no investigation and no more liquidations. Major Sterling had been quietly reassigned to a desk in a windowless room, his career effectively neutralized by the machine he had served blindly. Jackson's pension had been restored under a clerical correction, providing just enough to keep the sanctuary running. But the real closure didn't come from the money. It came from the weight of the silver tags Jaxson had engraved. No longer identified by asset numbers, they finally had their names back. The heartwarming peak of the morning happened near the edge of the clearing. Ghost, the Malinois who had spent years as a shivering pile of trauma, was sitting near a sun-dappled oak tree. Jaxson approached him, carrying a folded piece of olive drab fabric, Caleb's old flight suit. He knelt in the damp grass and held the fabric out. Jaxson felt the coarse texture of the fabric against his palms, a tactile connection to a brother who had never truly left his side. Ghost froze. His nostrils flared. Then the dog leaned forward, burying his muzzle deep into the fabric. A low, long whine escaped Ghost's throat, a sound of recognition, of grief, and finally of homecoming. The dog looked up at Jaxson, his dark eyes shimmering with a sudden clarity. He didn't see a stranger. He saw the man his master had trusted most. Ghost stepped forward and placed his head on Jackson's shoulder, a heavy pressure that finally broke the last of the ice around Jackson's heart. Jaxson closed his eyes, his arms wrapping around the dog. They weren't tears of loss, they were tears of relief. He wasn't alone. Caleb wasn't gone. He was right here, in the thumping of a tail against the earth. "We're home, Ghost," Jaxson whispered. "We're all home." The scene was a perfect circle, a direct response to the 3 a.m. auction. 4 hours had once separated these lives from a cold price tag. Now, those hours were filled with the sound of paws on floorboards and 12 stainless steel bowls lined up in the kitchen. The disposable inventory had become the foundation of Jackson's new life. He looked at the scars on his knuckles and then at the dog's, realizing they were made of the same resilient thread. They were the surplus of a world that didn't know how to value loyalty, but here they were the only currency that mattered. As the sun climbed higher, Jaxson realized his journey hadn't just been a rescue. He hadn't just saved 12 dogs. He had rescued himself from the rot of obsolescence. He had traded the snake-eye persona for the mantle of the protector. He was no longer a gear in a machine. He was the shepherd of a brotherhood. The rust had been burned away in the fire of the warehouse, leaving behind something harder and more purposeful. Maverick trotted up to Ghost, the 2 dogs touching noses in a silent communication between survivors. Jaxson stood up and looked out over the ridge. The path ahead wasn't easy. There were more assets out there being forgotten in the dark corners of the bureaucracy. But for the first time in years, Jaxson wasn't afraid of the fight. He had his pack, he had his purpose, and he had the knowledge that some bonds are forged in a fire that no incinerator can ever touch. He turned toward the cabin, the 12 dogs following him in a loose, disciplined formation. The porch light was off, for the day was full of possibility. As he reached the top step, he paused, looking at the sign he had carved into the beam. It didn't bear his name. It bore a promise. It was a reminder to any who might find their way up this mountain that loyalty has no expiration date, and that family is something you build with your own 2 hands. The transition to the final chapter felt natural. The battle for these 12 was won, but the war for how we treat those who serve was just beginning. Jaxson Thorne was no longer just a veteran with a dog. He was a beacon for those still trapped in the shadows. And as he walked into the house, the door clicking shut behind the last wagging tail, the message of the mountains began to echo, that in a world of scrap metal, the only thing truly worth keeping is the love that walks on four legs. Courage wasn't just about the charge, it was about the stay. It was about standing guard over the vulnerable until the world finally learned how to say thank you. And as the master of the craft, he was just getting started. He had found the light, and this time he was going to make sure it never went out again. Courage walks on 2 legs and 4. The smoke from the incinerator has dissipated into the cold mountain air, replaced by the scent of cedar shavings and pine. Jaxson Thorne sits on his porch, the wood groaning beneath his boots. The silence is no longer a void. It is a living, breathing thing, punctuated by the soft huffing of 12 sets of lungs and the clack of claws against the floorboards. Jaxson once believed he was a gear in a machine that had no use for old parts, only to realize the machine was wrong. A life is not a manifest item, and loyalty is not a commodity with an expiration date. He saved 12 dogs from the furnace, but in the process, they pulled him back from the cold burning of a man who has forgotten his purpose. In your life, have you ever felt like you were being moved toward the loading dock of obsolescence? Perhaps you have looked in the mirror and seen the silver at your temples, and felt the world's cold gaze treating you like inventory that has outlived its utility. We live in a culture that worships the new, often forgetting that the most profound strength is found in things weathered, scarred, and tested. Like the K9s Jaxson refused to leave behind, many of us reach a point where we are told our service life has ended. We are told to let the machine continue its grinding progress without us. But there is a sacred truth the mountains understand. The heart does not have a budget, and the spirit does not have a liquidation price. Courage is found in the one who stands up when the world says it is time to sit down. The transition from Snake Eye to the Protector was not a change of rank, but a change of vision. For decades, Jaxson saw the world through tactical utility. A dog was a sensor. A teammate was a capability. This gear philosophy suggests we are only as valuable as the work we produce. But sitting in the damp grass with Ghost, smelling the scent of Caleb's flight suit on the dog's fur, he realized a soul is something entirely different. A gear can be replaced, but a soul leaves a hole in the universe when it is gone. When he looked at Maverick, he didn't see a retired asset, but a partner who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and come out the other side with eyes still fixed on his master. This is the ultimate lesson of the mountain. We are who we love, and more importantly, who we refuse to abandon. For those who have reached the 50-year mark, this story is not just a veteran's tale. It is your story. The story of the father who wonders if his children still need his wisdom, or the worker who sees the younger generation moving faster. He chose to believe the scars on a Malinois' flank were medals of honor. He chose to see the gray on a German shepherd's muzzle as the signature of a life well lived. In your own life, you may feel the pressure to fade away, but remember the sunset is often more brilliant than the noonday sun. Your legacy is found in the lives you protected and the loyalty you stood by when it was no longer convenient. There is a powerful faith in the way a dog waits for its master, found in the weight of a head on a knee and the steady thrum of a tail. Jaxson didn't just offer his physical life. He offered his peace, his pension, and his safety. He realized stewardship of the vulnerable is the highest calling. When we protect those who cannot protect themselves, we touch something divine. We are saying the machine does not get to decide who matters. Life, in all its bruised forms, is a gift to be guarded, not a resource to be managed. This is the quiet philosophy of the ridge, that mercy is the only thing that truly lasts. Listen to the sounds of the cabin. The wind through the cedar branches carries the whispers of those who lived for something larger than themselves. Hear the crackle of the hearth fire, a warmth that thaws the heart. Jaxson Thorne is no longer a man waiting for the end of his story. He is a man who has started a new chapter, one written in pause and promises. He has learned that the rust of the past can be scrubbed away with purpose, and that the liquidation the world threatens is nothing compared to the fire of a renewed mission. He is the shepherd of the forgotten, and in that service he has found his own salvation. In your life, where is your station 9? What have you been tempted to give up on because the world said it was no longer efficient? Is it a relationship that has grown old, or a dream you've tucked away because you feel your time has passed? Jaxson Thorne's journey tells us that it is never too late to crash the gate. It is never too late to realize that your most important mission might begin when everyone else thinks you are done. The strength you have gathered over decades is not a burden. It is the armor you need for the fight that matters most. The world is loud and the machine is cold, but the heart is where the truth lives. Loyalty is a bridge over dark water. Scars are maps of where we've been. Your value is not determined by those who sign the checks, but by those who wait for you to come home. Look at the ones walking beside you. They don't care about your resume, only your presence. They are your pack. They are your purpose. Courage is not always a roar. Sometimes it is the quiet click of a crate opening. It is the choice to keep walking when the path is steep and the refusal to let a friend stand alone. As you move forward, remember the commander and the K9. Remember that the inventory of your life is actually a treasury of grace. Do not let the world tell you that your season has ended. Do not let the logic of liquidation enter your soul. You are a protector, a witness, a soul that cannot be replaced. Stand your ground, engage your purpose. Never forget the bond that transcends the uniform. Courage walks on 2 legs and 4. It's time to start the day. The pack is waiting, and you are exactly where you are meant to be. Be the shield for those who have served. Be the voice for those who have none. In the quiet moments, listen for the truth, that as long as there is breath, there is a mission. As long as there is love, there is a home. And as long as we stand together, the machine will never win. Courage walks on 2 legs and 4. Go out today and find something worth standing for. Whether it's an old friend or a gray-muzzled dog, remember that your service isn't over. It's just been refined. The world needs your scars, your wisdom, and your loyalty. Courage walks on 2 legs and 4. Stories like Jaxson and Ghosts don't end here. If you want to see what happened next and discover more stories that might change how you see everything, subscribe.